Today we have with us Laurel Maxwell, and want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Laurel Maxwell. I'm a Whitworth alum who graduated in 2006. I'm from the education program. I taught for 7 years in the classroom. So I was a special educator for 4 years at the secondary level. And then I spent 3 years teaching bilingual education in Monterey County. And that was third grade. And I'm here just to sort of dive into equity in education, and how that impacts teaching. And I feel it's a very timely conversation just in terms of what's happening in the world today. Just wanted to state too that this work comes from the Standards Institute, and so it is work that I sort of mixed and matched. So would like to give them credit for this as well. And I am excited to be here today and have this conversation. I just wanted to start off with what equity in education looks like. And so it can be when the biases that we have from the dominant culture and cultural norms no longer predict or influence how one fares in society. So as we're thinking today, we're thinking sort of around like white culture. And so we're thinking about equity around education. It permits fair and impartial access to rights and opportunities for students, all students in the classroom. And we'll sort of get into what that could look like. So it can look like adding supports and scaffolding in the classroom and fair access to opportunities such as curriculum, and going as far as technology, and making sure that you're creating ways for like all of your students' voices to be heard in the classroom. And that's ensuring all children are receiving high quality, grade level standards aligned instruction. I know you've probably been focusing a lot on standards. And so what this does is it provides educators to become change agents for educational equity, with the understanding that we are in a system where policies and practices can be inherently racist, and that educators are participating in the system. So thinking about as you're working in education, having those really hard conversations with yourself, they're not easy. And this is work that I'm also just beginning. So I'm learning this along with all of you. And so ensuring really your goal is like, how are you ensuring that all students are receiving an equitable education, regardless of where you're teaching, regardless is that inner city school, is this, it becomes even more relevant in areas where there's not as much diversity in terms of students, like that's where it sort of gets caught up, and making sure that students have grown against grade level standards and are confident in who they are. And so our objectives for today is to look at the role of institutional racism in the school system and become aware of sort of just thinking about your own bias and your influence on instruction. The reason this matters is that we are, as educators, you are influencing your students and the stories that they hear about themselves. So thinking about history is an easy example, but thinking about history, whose stories are they hearing in history textbooks? Are you hearing other voices? When you're talking about, slavery, are you hearing the slave's perspective? Are you really just focusing on, the dominant culture? And so thinking about telling others their stories, what does that do to your students? When they're able to connect with something like, I'm hearing an African-American voice. I'm hearing the voice of a Chicano leader in history. What does that do to your students and how that can really empower them? As opposed to when you're talking, in history, when I grew up, we only read one story. We're hearing about hearing about the slave owners, and you're sort of like, okay, but what are the other stories that are there? And what are students hearing when you're only showing one story? And what do they have the power to hear when they're hearing multiple voices? And this is history, this is the literature that you're sharing in your classroom. And sort of thinking around, it's making really intentional choices around what you are teaching for your students. And it's definitely a mind shift. It's not easy. You can spend a lot of time looking for those resources. They're just not there yet, but I recommend, if you can, start thinking about what stories you choose, how you can share different perspectives for students in your classroom that are really going to support them in their growth. So that's where we're going today. So what can that look like? Once again, assist ensuring that all students or all children, regardless of circumstances, are receiving rigorous grade level standards aligned with instruction supported by access to high quality materials and resources. When I'm talking about all students, I'm talking about your ELLs. I'm also talking about your students with special education, ensuring that that it's rigorous instruction. Working in special education, I ran up a lot against rigorous instruction from my students. This was when I was doing middle school. And a lot of teachers were like, well, they're not at grade level. I'm like, yes, but they can get there provided with the support and scaffolded instruction. All students can receive grade level standards aligned instruction. Will it take more work? Absolutely. Is it possible? Yes, but it's having understanding that your students can do the work and that it can be rigorous and have a really positive impact on who they become as they move through the school system. So we get in our own way. So what are educational equity? We think, yeah, that's great. This is something I really want to do. Let's do it. But this work comes from Paul Gorski. And he says there's some detours that we have to having equitable instructional practice. One is that the pacing for privilege, and that folks that are in the school system, they will talk about equity when they're ready. And if you think about what's happening today, we sort of reached that breaking point of like, folks, we're beyond ready. We've been wanting to talk about this for a long time. And so is talking about equity as soon as you can and not waiting for those that are privileged, especially those with white privilege, not waiting for us to be ready to talk about equity. It needs to start now. So that's one detour that we have. And then another one is a poverty of culture. So thinking about, sorry, I got my notes. Thinking about, we tend to think about folks as poverty being what families are stuck with. And it's like, well, what are the steps that got folks into poverty? What are the systematic barriers that families are facing that made it really hard for them to move out of poverty? From not being able to purchase a home, from like parents' education, from not being shown that they could progress. So changing that mindset of like poverty there's a systematic problem, and it's not something that you can solve now, but thinking about that poverty of culture and how has that impacted students that are in their classroom right now. Deficit ideology, same thing as you're seeing, oh, your special ed students, oh, those ELLs, they can't do it. So we're just gonna, keep them, we're not gonna try. And so that deficit ideology, it's too hard. Dumbing down curriculum, these things sort of prevent us from being equitable. And then a big one for me that we did a lot, we don't think about, is celebrating diversity. And so it's those celebrations that you have on site for Black History Month. You're like, yeah, we're doing it. We're gonna read all these books about Martin Luther King Jr. and we're gonna talk about how wonderful he is. But are you really talking about why he even had to have this fight and what he was fighting for? And so going deeper and not celebrating diversity, but thinking about why these conversations, and talking about he was fighting for civil rights. What does that mean? And so that is these are detours to making for educational equity. And I think for me, celebrating diversity was the biggest one. And it's one that I'm guilty of. When I was teaching, it's like, yeah, we're doing it. We're doing Black History Month. We're going to read the books, but not having the deep conversations with your students about the why behind it. So just things to keep in mind, and we'll sort of go through, give you a few tips at the end of how we could sort of move beyond this. So we're going to sort of switch gears a moment. So educational equity, we'll sort of switch back to this. And we're going to look now sort of like what where does bias come up in the school system? Just a really quick overview. This conversation will continue far after we're done, and it will be work that you will continue to do as educators. So there, I'm not giving you, it's not like here's your, educational equity 101. It's work that is always going to be in your classrooms, things you're thinking about as you work in education. So just want to put that out there. So switching gears, sort of thinking about bias and its role in education, where does it show up? So we experience the world through our own culture, language, and values. I'm a white woman, obviously. I grew up middle class. That affected how my values in life. So that, just to keep that in mind. I've had that, gratefully I've had the opportunity to travel, and so I've been able to see other cultures and sort of think about what life is like outside the US. But our culture isn't what we change, but just thinking about like who you are, which is wonderful, and please don't change. How is that impacting how you're teaching in the lens through which you're viewing the world? Going back to that worldview, I'm sure you're probably learning about. So just keep that in mind. Thinking about too, English is always changing. And then going to English, American English has many variants with rules of grammar, pronunciation, and usage. So thinking about, are we okay with students in classrooms talking in slang? And if we're not, what does that mean to our students? And if we're not welcoming that into our classrooms, what does that mean? What is that showing our students? And so going into proficiency with multiple variants of English is a strength. So we're thinking about students, who are ELLs, they're learning English, they're limited, and they're doing what they can, that's great. And access and proficiency with multiple languages is also a strength. It tends to, kind of think, oh, you can only, use one language in the classroom, but why not use Spanish if your students know Spanish? Or I think, because Russian still in Spokane, use those languages in the classroom, right? Being bilingual, there are huge benefits. Your language skills transfer. So, what you know in one language transfers to another. So being bilingual is a strong foundation. Use that language in the classroom if you can. So just keep those in mind. Is English only? I don't know if that's a great way. So think about how can you pull in home language and support students. I had a lot of parent-teacher conferences where parents like, I'm only speaking English at home. I'm like, please don't. Please speak native language at home. It just builds, the more literate you are in one language, it will increase your literacy in another. So if you're fluent in Spanish, read in Spanish, write in Spanish at home, watch TV, telenovelas in Spanish, and then, that will help in the classroom. So just keep that in mind as you're moving through and working with your ELL students and keeping that home language really prevalent in the home. And so that just goes back to thinking about you personally and thinking about what is your bias around those ideas. Have you thought about home language that, how are you going to manage that in your classrooms with like home language, students speaking other languages? Embarrassed one of my students, they didn't know that I spoke Spanish, and they were chit-chatting away, and I was like, ladies, in Spanish, I was like, ladies, you need to pay attention. They were like, like, it's like, so just thinking like, it's okay to use your language. It's okay to allow students to speak in Spanish or whatever their home language is. I'm using Spanish because that's what we eat here in California. But just think about, is that okay for them to use a non-English language in class? I don't know Washington's, I haven't been paying attention to Washington's like standards. I just know, and I had a colleague from Arizona and it was English only instruction, and they got in trouble for speaking in Spanish in their class. And so, wow, that's really hard. But going back, what does home language do? Is it okay in the classroom? What is that showing your students, right? That you're valuing them in their language. So let's keep that in mind. How does our bias show up? Hit on this, but our curriculum. So what are you teaching students? Whose views are they seeing? Whose views are they hearing? Discipline policies. Who's making those policies? Where are they coming from? Are they really equitable to all students? When you are, when kids are going in detention because they're late to work, are you taking in the whole picture? Are those parents struggling to get their kids to school on time because they're working 2 jobs or someone worked late. Is that equitable? Is that fair? You know, this can go, so and discipline policies are going to be different across schools, but just thinking about who are you really punishing when, you know, you're marking kids absent all the time? That's parents, and they're busy people, and do we know their whole story, and is that equitable? Thinking about what students can achieve. This goes back to your own bias. You know, even as a teacher, you know, it's hard. Thinking, so for me, it's like, I ran up against it a lot when I was working in special education, and teachers being, they can't do it, they're not smart enough. And I was like, yep, they can do it. It's going to take them longer. It's going to take some creative scaffolding in the classroom to make it work. So this thing about what are you holding, about what you think students can achieve. And this happens, we all have these. It's not something that we want to think about or look about or, you know, acknowledge, but it's there. And I had it with my students too. So just, you know, I had some students where you know, you're not sure. You're like, I failed you. I'm not sure how to reach you anymore. And so it's not a proud moment in teaching, but it's really something about how do you really help out your students get to where they need to go. Classroom management as well, thinking about what style you're using to manage your classroom. My classroom is pretty rambunctious. I like to hear my students talk and interact, and some teachers are like, oh man, your classroom's out of control. I'm like, nope, they're great. They're just having a really good time. They're interacting with each other. That's what I want them to do. So just think about like your classroom management style as you develop it, and how your bias can play a role in that management style. You know, thinking about how are you speaking to your students. You know, it's that power struggle that's going to develop. How are you speaking to them? Are you letting them share their experience? Are you going to be, nope, I'm not going to listen, I'm the teacher. So just thinking about how are you interacting with your students, even just like the tone of your voice, making things equitable. So just thinking about that as you develop classroom management styles. Where's your bias showing up? Can you release some of that power? Can you provide choice to students and be okay with that in the classroom? So these are all topics that are not easy, and they're going to take some hard looking at yourself, and like could be you continue to like, oh man, is that fair? My classroom management policy, discipline policies are school based. So like, are you going to feel comfortable talking to your principal, being like, you know what, I don't think this is fair. It's hard work, but keep it in mind that little by little you can be agents for change in making equitable instruction. And so moving along, one way that you can build equity is by connecting to standards, and thinking about how the standards have shifted since I was in school. And so previously, we're looking at, if you look at instruction like an iceberg, previously you're looking at where you want to focus, and you're looking at just definitions and things that are sort of like on the very top, and you're understanding what the text said. And now you're looking at, you're asking more complicated questions of students. So thinking about how, you know, we're talking about bias in education and curriculum and how that all comes together with our standards. And so this is a way that you can move students to have more equitable instruction. And so thinking about focusing on literacy, thinking about we're now asking students to understand language and its effect. And so how are you going to do that with your ELLs, understanding language, right? So thinking about cause and effect, what does that mean? Thinking about the sequence, understanding the author's purpose, what does that mean? Why are we reading this? What are they going to get out of it? Making sense of the text or tasks. So it's a lot of, you know, close reading strategies. What is the author saying, and why is that important to what we're learning? And then understanding figurative language, which is difficult for, I would say, English only speakers, and then trying to teach that to ELLs. Woo, it's hard, but it's definitely doable. And so it's just thinking about, when you're thinking about, you know, equitable instruction, um, it's very easy to be like, the students are going to learn, so we're going to keep them here at the top with just defining literary terms and understanding what the text says. It's right there. It's doable. But how do we use the standards to really push them to understanding author's purpose, for making sense of the text, for understanding figurative language? So it's not the same. Being able to remember something is not the same as making sense of what the text said. So it goes into a lot deeper learning. And so when we're talking about shifts for language arts, we're talking about complex text, and that's academic language. So complex text is those with multiple paragraphs. There's no pictures. It's your scientific text. It's first person narratives that students are being asked to interact with and really understand. It's using reading and writing, using evidence from the text. So it's talking about, where do you find your answer? What evidence do you have that a character is feeling this way? And really digging deep. That was definitely a struggle with some students I had. They wanted to like rush through things and they're like, I got it. I'm like, that's great, but tell me where you were able to find what a character thought in the text, and where's your evidence? And so it's really, for me, it was having the students slow down and work in groups and really thinking about, what is the text asking you and what do you need to know? So thinking about, character development is like, okay, you're telling me a character is having this conflict. Where's the evidence of that happening in the text? And really slowing down and getting your students to see that. And then through that, potentially building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. Difficult to find right now, but I hope it will be easier. I spent a lot of time trying to find good nonfiction text for students that was rigorous. I remember getting like my principal gave me this like science textbook. He's like, this is for your kids. And I was like, they're not reading this. This is like 2 paragraphs on like magnets. I don't think so. And so it took a lot of time to like find something that was rigorous enough for them to really like get a deeper dive into what was happening. So I definitely would have done that my first year of teaching. I would have been like, great, I'll take it. My 3rd or 4th year, I was starting to really question what I was presenting to my students and making it rigorous, but also like something that we could dig in together. So that was, it takes some time and courage to do that. And yeah, I'm hopeful that as you enter education, that these will not be as big as barriers to finding content-rich nonfiction for your students. But just know it did take some time. I did a lot of News ELA, which is a free website. And then Scholastic also had some nonfiction texts, which I could access as well. But it did take some time to really find what I was looking for. But once I did, I was like, okay, this works. So how can we, so sort of thinking about what are we looking for as change agents. So we're thinking about how can we analyze what the standards are asking us to create a trajectory for learning? Can you see the importance of academic language in the classroom? So that really high level content language, specifics. So talking about, can they use the main idea and explain what that means? Can they understand that text is complex? So it's not just that multi-paragraph words, first person narrative. Can we look at bias and its role in our own work and learning? So what does an educationally equitable environment look like? It's a rigorous curriculum for all students that they kind of have access to, and using scaffolds to help them get there and removing them when they're ready. So it's, modeling your instruction and then letting it go, which is difficult, but is it helpful if we're holding students' hands the whole way? So learning how to let that instruction go a little bit. And can we, using the shifts, can you recognize how teaching with the standards can be helpful to you as you're in the classroom? So how do we become change agents? Doing the difficult work that we have the difficult work that we're doing in the classroom. through instruction and pedagogy, and committing to ensuring that all students, regardless of how they come to us, leave having gone against grade level standards, confident in their value and their abilities. Committing to me was very difficult. Students come to you from all different backgrounds. And when they step into your classroom, they have a lot going on. But create a safe space for your students, and just thinking about, you can't change their home life. You can't change their life outside of school, but in your classroom, you can be a positive influence of where the students are going. And you might be the one safe space that your students visit all day. So just keep that in mind. Yeah, that's a difficult one, to just to let go, let your students enter as they are. I know that they are kids, or if you're doing middle school and high school, they're still kids, students. So that's just something to keep in mind, but definitely something I was having to work through. So we sort of talked about our detours to equity. What do we do, right? What are some ways that we can make instructional, going back to making instruction equitable? And so once again, this goes back to Paul Gorski, and he said, we've come up with these detours, these things that we get in the way of making our instruction fair. And so he said there's ways that you can fight against this. And one way is through direct confrontation. And so that's looking at your policy and your curriculum and your discipline practices for racial inequity. I'm trying to think. So when I went to, about this work is coming from the Standards Institute, and I remember seeing a very powerful image, and I wish I could find it to share it with you, but it was Black and brown children, and they were being asked to line up sort of like their hands like in front of them, and then next to that image was Black and brown inmates in a correctional facility in the same line. And so, not to say students shouldn't stand in line, but thinking about, it was a really powerful image of like, we're asking them to stand in line, hands, behind their backs. That's also a very similar image of Black and brown folks in prison. And so before that, I did not even cross my mind. And I was like, oh crap. I was like, oh man. So just thinking about, what are we asking students to do and why? And that's a difficult example. Redistribution of, examine how some students have more access to curriculum than others. So we're thinking about, even now, so you're thinking about technology is an easy one. Thinking about now in this pandemic, you're thinking about what students have access to technology at home. And how is that impacting when we're moving all this instruction online? How is that impacting families that don't have access to technology? And is there a way to redistribute, technology to students? Thinking about when you're asking students to do, if you're asking students to do homework, and you're asking them to, make a post, do a poster board. Do students have access to like glue, scissors? It's silly, but like, do they have access to glue and scissors and poster boards at home? And so being able to sort of think through those projects with your students and being able to like redistribute that access of like, well, you might not have it, glue and scissors, so I'm going to provide you some you can use in the classroom or take it home with you. It's a mind shift, for sure. And then also prioritizing. So thinking about going back, prioritizing the interest of your students of color in the classroom. Connecting your curriculum. So thinking about, for my students, we did a lot of connecting a lot to like sports and soccer in the classroom, but also just thinking about like, what are their interests that can help them. And then equity ideology is really thinking about understanding how racism operates and its dynamics in society and our school, where this is very current right now with what's happening. So it's not easy. But once again, going back to the curriculum, going back to what you're teaching and why, your discipline policies. And then the last piece is fixing injustice, which is, it focuses on limiting racist conditions and not students of color. And what I mean by that, it's, once again, what are the barriers that have been in place that have made it really hard for students of color to have equitable access? Their zip code, right? That's a huge, your zip code is a huge determinant of like what type of education you're gonna have, unfortunately. And so why is that happening? You know, why are, how are they being treated? What are the conditions that their parents are facing that are making it really hard for them to get to be supportive? One that was difficult for me was the parent-teacher conferences for students. And, you know, at one point I had like, I think it was 60 students, and there were parents that wouldn't show up, and you're like, they don't care. Definitely a bias on my part. And so, but do the parents have access? We're asking them to come at really random times, like 2:30. Are they working all day? Can they get childcare? Are they taking public transportation? Maybe the bus broke down. Like, these are just things that, you know, fixing a system of like, okay, parents need childcare. So we started providing childcare on site during parent-teacher conferences. We joked about should have done it, but we, you know, talked about maybe we have a van that like goes and picks up parents so that they can come to these parent-teacher conferences. It's really thinking outside that box of like, what are these barriers and how do you sort of break them down so that parents can become more involved? Maybe it's holding parent-teacher conferences really early in the morning or late at night or over Zoom. Well, maybe not if there's technology, but it's trying to be really thoughtful and intentional about what you're asking, and then thinking about, okay, what are some barriers, but also doing it in a way that's going to be respectful of parents. So it's a very fine line. I did notice, you know, but providing childcare on campus was really helpful for parents. Like, thank you, we can drop off our little kids, we can really focus on the conference. That was just a really a good option for parents at one of the schools that I worked with. So what can you do? What are some action steps that you can take as educators now and as you're moving through your program? So it's thinking about building your awareness of equity issues which surround education. So they're always going to be there. And then beginning to have discussions with their colleagues. They're not easy conversations, right? But you can start by thinking about how can you be looking at your instruction, looking at yourself, and thinking about your bias, thinking about, you know, as you move into your teaching program, what curriculum are you going to be teaching and why? How can you find those other resources that are going to be complex texts that are going to show different perspectives for students? You know, and I wish I had the courage to do this, but like, you know, if you're interviewing, sort of thinking about those policies, you know, in schools you're interviewing for, like, what are these policies? Why are they here? So those things to think about, and then having these discussions now. So once again, this is great. You're recording this, you're taking this to your colleagues, and just having these conversations to think about as you move forward. Some resources, Paul Gorski, which a lot of this work came from, he wrote Equity Education Detours, and then Courageous Conversations About Race, which is thinking about education and race in the classroom, are two resources I found very helpful. There's also Abram Kendi's Stamp from the Beginning. So that's also just a resource in general about race in our country that you can also sort of look at and sort of like begin to analyze. So, and then I'm also White Supremacy Handbook. It's just something I've been working through personally to sort of thinking about where are my biases and how are they coming up as just things to think about. So once again, these are Paul Gorski and Courageous Conversation are definitely more education focused. The White Supremacy and Me Handbook is definitely more an internal look at yourself and sort of doing that hard work of becoming a change agent in your own self. So that's what I have today. I don't know if you have any questions or comments that you would like to sort of end this on, once again, I appreciate your time with us today. This is definitely something I've, a new passion of mine that I wanted to be able to share as an educator and an alum. And I just felt now today more than ever, it's a very prevalent in our system. So I appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. This
Yeah.
was very informational. I'm so glad
Yes.
we had you.
Yes, thank you. It was super interesting.
You're welcome.
I do have a question though.
Yes.
How would you bring up like the topic of racial inequality in the classroom? Like, would you talk about it with your students? Like, you said that you would have deep conversations with them, but I just wondered, like, how would you go about that?
I would talk about them with it. Talk about. I would have this conversation with them. I remember some feedback. I think it was my second year teaching, and I was teaching, Martin Luther King Jr. and one of my colleagues came in and she's like, I talked to your students and they don't really understand why he was important. I was like, oh, I missed a really important point of like, why did we have civil rights, right? That I missed that completely. And so it's thinking about that can be a starting point of like, what are civil rights and why are they important? And talking about the equity and why were African Americans the ones that needed to have civil rights? And that's a whole history we're fighting against right now, right? So I've given those conversations there of, civil rights, equity, finding that literature that can sort of support them. But I would have these conversations, and they're difficult. I'm trying to think, younger grades. Yeah, because you can talk. I'm just thinking about like younger, K2, K3, just talking about skin color. I mean, right? Like you're gonna, meet people with different colors. Does that matter? Are you all the same? I feel definitely like like fifth to high school is probably a little easier to like really dive deeper into those like conversations. But it's definitely those conversations that I would have hoped to have had with my students. Difficult, but something I wish that I had done. How to start? That's difficult. I would, interest. Kids are curious. They ask really good questions. They ask really uncomfortable questions sometimes. Like, oh man. So I think I would, when you get a question that's uncomfortable, try to figure out, okay, what can you do with that information? And it might be needing to be like, you know what? I need to do some research and come back to you. That's totally okay. You do have to think on your feet a lot. But it's okay to say, you know what? That's a great question. I'm a teacher, or however you want to phrase it. You ask a great question. I want to do some more research and come back to you prepared. So be okay with saying that you need some time. I'm trying to think, equity, it could even just be beginning of the school year. Like, what is equity? What does that mean in my classroom? It means that you're going to have the best education that you can get. I'm going to treat you all fairly. You're going to kids all the time. I got it all the time from just like, they're funny. But they were like, you're treating someone differently. I'm like, oh boy. But just trying to be, just equitable as, making classroom meals together, teaching about term, I think there's different ways that you could look into this issue, that you could talk about equity in your classroom. And this is a theme, talk about it all year. Is it fair that some students have to do a Saturday school? Get them write a paper about it. I mean, it's, these are things that they'll be interested in. But it is no good in be knowing your students and so where they're coming from.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question too.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier about finding rigorous curriculum.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you had any suggestions that you have used in your classroom that have been helpful to you.
Yes. So I used one that I found is News ELA was one of the most helpful ones. What I liked, it's free. What I liked about that one is that you could change the Lexile level depending on your students. So you could have, if you're having, so you could have the same article, but it would be at different reading levels for your students. So that one I found helpful. And then just a lot of, and if I find more, I could send it to you too, because I'm just thinking off the top of my head. But that was the biggest one I found, that I found like had rigorous, like it was science-based. So there's a lot about, I was teaching about like Galapagos Islands, and so I found like this whole bunch of different articles on, Galapagos Islands and volcanoes, and then I think, what's the other one? A to Z Reading has little booklets that are also leveled, that are also found helpful. And those are all nonfiction topics. And I think both those resources are free. I threw away the textbooks pretty quickly when I, not threw away, but I'm trying to think, I was doing third grade, so it had been my fourth year teaching. It was like these little stories. I was like, these are crappy. And so I don't know if I'd recommend it your first year. I think you need that structure. But I was like, I'm not using this. And I started looking for other resources. I would, reach out to some of your colleagues too, if when you're on site, and saying, hey, what are some, ways that you found to help your students? Scholastic magazines have some good resources, especially for middle school. And they also have some online articles as well, that can be leveled, that are also free. So that was what made the work most difficult for me, was the time it took to find the resources that I felt were supportive enough for my students. And sometimes it'd be like, okay, I'm just gonna go with what I have. I can't spend another hour looking for one article. But I think that those two resources are pretty strong, to be able to get you started. So, yeah, good questions. I wish I had those resources a lot earlier when I was teaching, but yeah.
Do you have any other questions, Hannah?
I don't think so. To look through my notes.
There's a lot.
Yeah, there was a lot.
There is a lot, and this is totally just skimming the surface of, totally skimming the surface. So,
what would you do if you like saw one of your colleagues for like dumbing down a student or their curriculum? Like you mentioned that, but like, what would you do if you saw that happening? Like, would you do anything? Would you talk with them?
that's a good question, because I've been in that situation and I don't think I handled it very well.
Yeah, because I wouldn't know if it would be my place at all to just.
Yeah, I'm thinking, because that's tricky, because it's what relationship do you have with that teacher, right? Good question. Hold on a minute. I would maybe offer, hey, yeah, that's a good question. Hold on. What would I do? Maybe connecting it to standards, like, hey, are these what you're teaching them really at standards? Helping them get to good grade level. Asking if you can help provide them with some resources. It's very, teachers is busy. And so I feel like the more support you can offer someone when you ask a question. So, hey, I noticed this curriculum or these readings might seem a little easy for your students. Are there some other ways that I can help you, make them read more difficult, or maybe start there. It's also tricky because I don't know, some schools might have you be following a curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And so that also gets tricky too, as if you're asked to follow a curriculum, how much wiggle room you have to maneuver, I don't know. I'm just trying to think, when I did special education, I ran into that a lot. And so I just provided more rigorous reading for my students when they're in my classroom. So that might, if you're have the opportunity, when students are like sort of if they're swapping. When I taught third grade, it was a dual immersion school. So they swap classrooms 3 times. And so, if students are in your classroom, maybe you can provide a little more rigorous curriculum and maybe share that with your colleague. But I sort of feel it's going to be case by case, because you're going to maneuver what's the relationship you have with this teacher. What can you do what are you running up against with like the curriculum in your school? But I would definitely keep that question in the back of your mind, and sort of like as you're thinking through this process of like maybe coming up with some ways you can start that conversation, and then having some like things in your back pocket to pull out. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I was just going back to you, Lyndon. I would just say too, thinking about like the standards and how you can always pull those out and be like, it's about rigorous curriculum, right?
Mhm.
So if you're not using rigorous curriculum, who's that? Are you helping your students succeed? So I could see it going that way too.
Right. Yeah. Getting them where they need to be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. This was
Welcome.
so helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks for answering all of our questions too.
No, anytime. If you have more, please feel free to send them my way.
I will. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.